The Walk to the Door is the 7th episode of the 5th season of Everybody Loves Raymond. This is directed by Asaad, and as always there will be spoilers from now as I go through the episode and share some thoughts. It's an okay episode, it's not my favourite, but there are some really, really funny moments. So I'll go through things chronologically, and it starts off with everybody in the car going to a wedding, and Ray happens to mention that he once had one date with a woman called Elizabeth, who's probably going to be at this wedding. And Marie said, "You were so picky back then," suggesting, of course, that he wasn't that bothered when it came to Debra. And Ray explained that he actually didn't walk her to the door after their date because it was snowing and he was worried about leaving the car. And he kind of feels really guilty about that. And we get to the wedding, really nice environment, really nice venue, love the costumes, everybody looks fabulous. And Ray and Debra are dancing on the dance floor and they bump into Elizabeth. She's played by Vicki Juditz and she doesn't seem to remember the door thing. Initially, Ray doesn't mention it. He just happens to mention the date and she seems quite happy about it. He goes back to the table, but it's kind of eating away at him. So he goes back to Elizabeth and brings up the door issue and kind of makes an explanation for it and apologises. And she didn't even remember it, which, in a way, was good news for Ray, but also maybe not good news because she couldn't remember part of the details of the date. Now, it was a long time ago, I don't expect her to, but Ray could remember it really well. So maybe he expected her to remember it, and maybe it would hurt his feelings a little bit if she didn't remember it as much as he did. And they're back at the table, and Debra asks why he's so concerned about this, yet he doesn't seem to care about things that he's done that have maybe inconvenienced Debra or have been not very nice to Debra. And she asks him for a regret, just one thing that he regrets about the treatment of her. And Robert is sent to dance with the children, which was very funny, really, really great moment. And Ray finally says to her that she deserves all of the love that you can fit in the ocean. And Marie asks Frank why he doesn't say nice things to her like that. And Frank takes the opportunity to say, "I would love it if you were in the ocean." Marie's face in that moment was just absolutely fantastic. What Frank said was funny, but I loved Marie's response even more. Ray finally comes up with a regret. And he talks about how Debra's not necessarily funny at parties and social gatherings, and he mentions a time when she made a joke, nobody laughed, and he didn't laugh either. And that was his regret for not supporting her in that way. And Debra seems quite happy about that. She seems quite satisfied. And Marie then starts to say her regrets, and she goes around and says some regrets. And she turns to Frank and she says, "And Frank, some regrets speak for themselves," which after what he just said about her wishing she was in the ocean is fair enough. I don't think she regrets marrying him. Just like I don't think Frank actually regrets marrying her. It's just part of their love language to constantly insult each other. And Robert, having danced with the children, comes back to the table and it's his turn to say some regrets. And he says, "Regrets, where shall I start?" To which Ray responds, "How about that haircut?" Which I rather liked. And immediately, Robert, having not heard what Ray's regret was, starts to tell a story about how his ex-wife made a joke in a public setting and nobody laughed, and he didn't laugh either. And it took a couple of seconds for Debra to say that Ray stole Robert's regret. Robert, confused by this, of course, said, "You stole my regret?" And his facial expression in that moment was brilliant as well. Absolutely loved that. And obviously Debra's really annoyed by this, and Marie then starts to tell more regrets because it turns out that she lied to Ray. And she had told Ray that Elizabeth had a crush on him, and if she asks him to the dance, Ray should go along. But it turns out that actually Marie had talked with Elizabeth and asked her to ask Ray to the dance. And Elizabeth, I guess feeling sorry for Ray, decided to do this. So it was kind of out of pity or out of Marie's instruction that she asked him to the dance, not because she had any interest in him. And obviously Ray's hurt by this, and he goes over to confront Elizabeth, saying, "You never wanted me to walk you to the door anyway," and he made a bit of an embarrassment out of himself. And then we end with the family in the car, and a joke about smearing honey on Frank and leaving him in the woods because he's fallen asleep. And it just kind of fizzled out a bit. I've mentioned this before, and I don't know if I used to think this with the earlier seasons, but certainly with recent episodes, I feel like the endings of Everybody Loves Raymond just kind of flatten out a little bit. They just kind of drop off. There's no satisfying ending. There's no funny moment. I mean, there was a bit of comedy there, but I didn't think it was that funny. It feels like it hasn't concluded. I feel like I'm left wanting a bit more of a resolution to the narrative. And I have felt this way with, I don't know if I've felt this way with all of the episodes in this season so far, but certainly a good chunk of them. And that's absolutely the case with this one as well. So in general, a good episode, some really funny lines, some really great quotes that I enjoyed sharing here. Some brilliant facial expressions as well. In general, not a bad episode. I think it could cause people to maybe think about things that they've regretted and wondering whether it's worth bringing them up with other people. But I think we also have a great message that something you might regret, such as not walking somebody to the door, might not actually have been a big deal anyway. So maybe don't let things eat away at you, particularly if you're not going to do anything about it. Ray has obviously never had the thought to call Elizabeth over the years to do anything about it, because at the end of the day, it isn't that big of a deal. So things that might be a thing of regret for you may not actually mean that much to the other person. Of course, it might, so that's not always guaranteed. But I think there are some great messages, some really strong takeaways, some very funny lines, some very funny facial expressions. Not the strongest ending, but ultimately, I think that the walk to the door is a good episode of Everybody Loves Raymond.